Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second of 4 sessions of Returning to School with Equity in Mind. We are delighted to have so many of you joining us today. My name is Kimberly Dickerson. I'm a postdoctoral researcher with Youth-Nex and the Equity Center, the two centers at UVA that co-sponsored this series. Youth-Nex aims to expand and apply the science of positive youth development to address societal challenges, and the Equity Center works to redress racial and socioeconomic inequities in university communities like ours. We invite you to visit both centers' websites, follow them on social media, or sign up for the Youth-Nex newsletter to learn more about ongoing work. I'd also like to introduce Leslie Boreen, the Assistant Director of Communications at Youth-Nex, who will be helping to moderate today's session. Before I introduce today's speakers, we have a few housekeeping notes, some of which you can see on the slide currently. As a webinar participant, you are automatically muted. However, we will allow you to ask questions throughout the session using the Q&A option located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And during the designated Q&A time, which will happen at the end of the session, you can use the raise your hand option and we will unmute you and you will be able to speak directly with the presenters. Next, we are recording this presentation and it will be available later on our website. The slides from today's presentation will also be available later. We are tending to post them on Fridays, so by tomorrow, hopefully on our website. Finally, if you're interested in receiving professional development credit for attending the webinar, you can contact Youth-Nex, that's YOUTH-NEX @virginia.edu for documentation. I would now like to introduce our speakers for today. They will be talking about student mental health and teacher well-being. Mike Lyons is an assistant professor of education in the clinical and school psychology program at UVA. Along with Julia Taylor, Dr. Lyons directs the Virginia Partnership for School Mental Health, which is a statewide program designed to expand the number of mental health professionals employed in schools. His research focuses on evidence-based prevention programs, particularly youth mentoring programs that are designed to promote mental health of students in schools. Marissa Bavana worked as an early childhood educator for 8 years prior to beginning her doctoral program. Her interest in psychology stemmed from a desire to better understand the needs of her students. She aims to work collaboratively with teachers to support student and teacher mental health. Sydney Simmons, our third presenter, received her master's in education from Harvard's Graduate School of Education, where she studied social and emotional learning interventions in elementary and middle schools. She continues to study prevention and intervention and has worked with local children and families as an associate clinician in the Sheila Johnson Center at UVA. And last but not least, we have Maria Acevedo, who does research and clinical work that centers around mental health, classroom experiences, and issues of equity in early childhood. She has served as a mental health consultant to local Head Start teachers, both across the school year and throughout this summer, as they transition back to providing in-person services. So thank you all for being here today, and I will pass it over to our presenters.
Thanks, Kimberly. And thanks everybody for joining us today. Just by way of introduction to this presentation, we really want to kind of focus on 3 areas. One, preparing for an unpredictable year. We all know that this has been an unprecedented time, and both the mental health and academic needs of our students are, as educators, a priority. In the second part of this presentation, we want to talk specifically about addressing classroom and social emotional needs and provide some practical suggestions for educators to think about their own well-being and the well-being of the students. And in the third piece of this presentation, we want to talk about supporting individual students, particularly thinking about how to identify and help students who may be struggling and may not be obvious to us. So to frame that conversation, I want to first just acknowledge that this has really been an unprecedented time, and that when we think about mental health, both mental health for our students and for us as educators, mental health providers, school staff, everybody's facing different kinds of stressors. Both at the individual level, individual characteristics, my own personal experiences, my own experiences with mental health and well-being affect how I respond to stress. And also from a systems perspective, that the context that we're living in today is one where public health and public policy are at the fore of people's thoughts today with the COVID pandemic, but also systemic racism with the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and too many others, economic stressors with what is it, 20% or so of folks who are unemployed at the moment. And so the interaction between the context in which we're living in and our individual ability to respond to stress really should be guiding the way that we're thinking about mental health, both again for us and for our students. I want to just take a moment to pause. We don't have obviously time to really have a discussion about this, but I want to pause to think, for you to think a moment about what are the individual and contextual kinds of factors that are contributing to either your resiliency during this time or if you're experiencing some stress. So I just want to pause for a moment and have you all think about that. So as we as presenters were thinking through this, these are some of the things that we were thinking about in terms of how students and staff members may be disproportionately affected by COVID and the context in which they're living. So individuals' experiences related to race and racism, individual experiences with health problems associated with COVID or just health issues that may have come up during this time, potential differences of experiences with loss and grief and differences in learning environment. I know that we've met with many of the school divisions as part of the Partnership for School Mental Health, and just talking about some of the challenges that our rural communities are facing in terms of internet access and broadband access as contributing to both their ability to access educational academic outcome supports, but also mental health supports. So again, to guide this discussion, we want to be thinking both at the individual level and at the contextual level for planning for the supporting student mental health in schools. And with that, I want to turn the presentation over to Marissa, who's going to talk about how do we plan for the unplanned.
Yeah, so we wanted to start by sharing some ways that you can prepare for this. You know, unpredictable, unprecedented. I mean, these words don't really do it justice, but we thought that this tweet kind of summed up the fall and what's being asked of teachers right now. So admin in 2020, please be prepared to teach online, in person, both simultaneously and on a moving train, while juggling in a burning building under the sea during a wrestling match with a T-Rex as a hologram riding a unicorn. Also be safe and we value you. So keeping this context in mind and just knowing how much you're all being asked to do and that this is your vacation time, we really tried to keep our tips reasonable and actionable. So small changes and light lifts that you can weave into your classroom schedule and routine that will hopefully help like your mental health and your students' mental health. So resetting prior to re-entry. Before returning to school, we thought it might be helpful for teachers to set aside some time to reflect on your strengths and principles and experiences. So intentionally taking time to revisit your reasons for being in the field and what your professional values are can really support you as you make choices, prioritize tasks, and articulate reasons behind your actions during these times when there's just so much uncertainty. Your perspective and expertise are really valuable. So you know your students and their needs, and just being there consistently, observing and noticing what is happening with your students is an important piece of the puzzle in addressing students' mental health needs. And then reflecting on your experiences from the spring. You've been through some of this already, so you're in a position to build on what was successful. I mean, reflecting on that, the fact that there were successes under these extraordinary circumstances is just really amazing. And also, anticipating what you might need to work on or change. And just approaching this with curiosity and non-judgment of yourself and students. So, like that didn't quite work. I wonder what would happen if I tried it a different way. And finally, just trying to reframe the situation a bit. So, are there opportunities to make positive changes or try something new in this time of change and flux? And are there new ways to advocate for your needs and your students' needs? And then teacher well-being is just so connected to, in my mind, student mental health and equity, because you making a realistic plan for self-preservation now that includes strategies for managing stress in the moment and throughout the day allows you to approach these new challenges, act in ways that are really aligned with what your values are intentionally, and also being a model for students so that they can see you practicing coping strategies. And although this sounds simple, just thinking about the extra stressors and responsibilities that you'll all be facing this fall with different schedules, managing new technology, hand washing, social distancing, masks, just to name a few. And then while managing your stress and the stress of the children in your classroom, we just thought it might be helpful to plan ahead of time and sort of put a routine in place now to save you time and energy later. So I'm just going to walk through creating a self-preservation plan and strategizing to make it stick. I know for me teaching, I often knew what I needed to do to care for myself. But what was more challenging was finding time, fitting it into my schedule, balancing it with other demands, and even just remembering to pause and use strategies in the moment. So we've highlighted some questions you might want to consider as you're making your plan. And we'd really encourage you to, write it down, post it, revisit it, tweak it, share it with friends or colleagues, and continue to come back to it and make sure that it's something that you're really sticking to and doing. So the questions include sort of starting with, how can I take care of myself? And what are the basic things that I need to make sure that I'm okay? And, there's the different domains. There's physical, there's mental health, there's what you can do at home, at school, and then in this in between territory where you might be at home teaching online, and it's both spaces. And I do wish that there was time for teachers to share ideas, because I know that you all have your own really amazing strategies, and I hope that you have time to share them with colleagues and listen to other people's ideas and get motivation and inspiration. And then next is incorporating these practices into your day-to-day routine. So when the rubber hits the road. So trying to set smaller, manageable goals that are trackable. So for example, even if I have a lot of planning and grading to do, I'll take a 30-minute walk 3 times a week. And finding ways to remind yourself. So putting up a visual cue like a Post-it or setting an alarm. Adding it into your schedule at a particular part of the day can be helpful. So stretching before breakfast, or checking in on your mood during classroom transitions or in between Zoom meetings or classes. And then integrating strategies into some of these new routines creatively. So maybe pairing cleaning with a mindfulness exercise. And we also put in some resources for mindful hand washing. So, these are things that you need to do, but sort of turning it into a moment to reflect and be self-aware and pause and check in with yourself. So feeding two birds with one cracker. And then partnering up and checking in can also be really helpful. So finding a partner in crime who will either take a walk with you, take an online exercise class, or even just text check in. How are you? Did you do what you planned to do today? And holding each other accountable. Next, sort of anticipating and planning for what obstacles you'll encounter and thinking about and problem solving for addressing them. So of course, like these depend on what your particular unique plan is for yourself, but thinking ahead of time. So if you want to take that walk, can you ask your partner to watch the kids for half an hour? If you feel like you're not going to have time, it's a really busy day, can you schedule something shorter in or take like a 5-minute break at some point? And last but definitely not least, tapping into your support network and knowing who you can go to when you've had a tough day, and also, you know, to share successes with. So a friend or a colleague who really understands your position and what you're going through, that's really important, and just sharing strategies with each other. So we realize a lot of this sounds intuitive, but just it can be really helpful to have a concrete and specific plan in place to refer to when you need it. And then if you start now, you can troubleshoot and figure things out before the fall comes around and things just, you know, start getting crazy again. And we will be talking about some more concrete strategies later. They'll be framed as strategies for students, but they are evidence-based practices that can definitely be used by teachers and other adults as well. So I'm going to pass it on to Sydney now.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about addressing classroom social and emotional needs. And as Marissa said, I'm going to incorporate some ideas for teacher well-being as well. So when we were thinking about this, we really, again, wanted to come up with some considerations that were both really easy to implement, but also really impactful for the classroom and for student mental health. So today I'm going to talk about each of these in detail: connecting with students, addressing new stressors, building an inclusive community, and empowering youth voices. So for those of you who were here last week, we talked a lot about connecting with students and how when students experience stress for a prolonged period of time and do not have a caring adult in their life who is there to process that with them, that can be really detrimental to their well-being. And on the flip side, teachers can really serve as that caring adult relationship in a student's life. We know that when kids feel safe and accepted in their classroom, that they're better able to manage the day-to-day stressors that come up for them. It doesn't mean those stressors go away, but they're able to handle them and kind of access those coping skills that they naturally know how to use. We also know that because teachers are human, teachers also are better able to respond to students' behavior, especially unhelpful behaviors, when they feel like they have a close relationship with that student. So whether virtual or in person, we really encourage you to spend some time one-on-one getting to know your students as individuals and not just as learners in your classroom. We also encourage you to find time for students to share with one another and with the broader group about what their experience has been like during this time, and really get that chance to process it. Since you all know how best to engage your students and what works with your style, what works with your students, what works in your context, we don't really want to go over specific strategies for connection. Rather, we want to emphasize two different things. One of which is kids are coming in with a lot of stressors. And some of these stressors, they're not really able to process at home because they might be related to things that are going on at home. And so school might be where they need to process these stressors. It's really important that they hear that these stressors are valid and that teachers are able to acknowledge that students are going through a lot right now. And some of these concerns, again, are very valid and cannot necessarily be ignored in the classroom context. Students are also going to express their concerns through their behaviors. But most of these behaviors will be associated with some type of feeling of stress, anger, frustration, etc. And while we're going to talk later in the presentation about how to deal with specific behaviors from your students, what is really, really important is that when they are expressing some kind of behavior, that you are validating the emotion behind that and uncoupling those two things. So being able to say, I understand why you're feeling that way, or I would be really frustrated too. And then dealing with the behavior is really important. Students will also learn from this, and when they see their teachers validating others' emotions, they'll learn that having emotions is okay, it is normal, and then they may also start to validate their peers' emotions as well, which can create a really healthy emotional environment. We also know that just having a close relationship with an adult is not necessarily enough. We also need to have some explicit coping skills or ways that we can address some of our stressors. So first, before we get into coping skills, I want to go over a couple of ideas that you can use in your classroom to address some of the things that kids might be grappling with. First, some kids might feel like they didn't really get closure from last year. All of a sudden, they were in the classroom and then they were doing online learning and they weren't really able to connect maybe in the same way. And so something that you can do is either help kids to write a letter to their old teacher. You can encourage kids to jump on a Zoom call with an old teacher, something like that, just so that they have that experience of closure and can feel like they're jumping into this new school year with a fresh start, whether it is in person or online. We also know that we are in the midst of a global pandemic, and our country and world is engaging in reignited conversations about systemic racism that is both historical and very pervasive currently. And so these are things that we can't ignore in the classroom. These are things kids are coming in worried about, and rightfully so. And so I know that there are a lot of resources out there right now for how to address these in the classroom. And I just really encourage everyone to think about what makes sense in your context, both with the developmental age of your students, as well as with the resources that you have. Also, again, we've talked about this a little bit, but thinking about how to explore new emotions in the classroom environment. So kids probably don't know what it looks like when someone is feeling really anxious. They might know what it feels like for them, but there's an opportunity right now, maybe to incorporate in a science class or something like that, to learn about emotions and physiological experiences of emotions, and maybe do some psychoeducation around stress and some of the other things that kids are feeling right now. Last, this is a time that we are going to be looking back on for a long time, for good or for bad. And in order for kids to really process that, both the gravity of some of the things that they've experienced and also this really unique, unprecedented time, it may be worth giving kids an opportunity to document their experiences in a way that is fueled by whatever their interests are. So if a kid really likes singing or writing lyrics to songs, maybe it's writing a song about their experiences. If they like to write, maybe it looks like journaling. If they're young, maybe it's just drawing a picture of what their family looks like during this time. But giving kids individual opportunities to process their experiences and then kind of an optional opportunity to share those experiences could be really helpful in, again, addressing these stressors. now I want to spend some time talking about explicit coping skills that can be used for both kids and adults in the classroom. And the reason that we want to go over multiple of these is different skills work for different people. And they also work for different people at different times. And so we want both teachers, staff in the classroom, and also students to kind of have a toolbox where they can choose what tool works for them in the moment. So while I'm going to go over each of these individually, I do want to mention that for sake of time, I'm not going to go into as much detail as we might want to. And so we've linked a bunch of different resources in the appendix that we will be sending out later, as Kimberly mentioned earlier. So first, related to practicing breath and mindfulness, mindfulness can be a really helpful strategy because it can be used anytime, any place, during any kind of activity. So mindfulness is just being able to be in the moment and recognize what's happening in the moment and be non-judgmental about it. It can include maybe using your senses to think about what you can see, hear, feel, touch in the moment, or it could be really focusing on the sensations in your body at a certain time. So there are a lot of different ways that we can use mindfulness. And I really liked how Marissa mentioned using mindfulness during hand washing. I know that's going to be a big thing that we're doing, whether we're at home or in the classroom. And so teaching kids to use that moment that is going to now be part of the routine to practice mindfulness could be really powerful. We also know that mindfulness is really important when we think about being equitable educators. So in order to really be equitable, we need to be able to recognize our own biases and uncouple the ways in which we have always, habitually gone about interacting with people in our classroom and in our community with how we want to. And so just being mindful of the biases that we all have and recognizing them and not judging ourselves, but making sure we act differently can be important. Leslie, I see that you popped up here.
Sorry to interrupt. There was a question about the activities that you had just listed on the slide. If these were available or going to be printables regarding my COVID-19 experience, how could teachers get those if they wanted?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think they're included right now, but we can definitely include a link to that specific resource in the document that we send out.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Perfect timing. Well, now to talk about a calm down toolkit. So we know typically that in classrooms, there are areas for students to either go when they need to regulate themselves or processes that they go through to regulate themselves. And that might not be feasible this year. We know that it might not be sanitary, it might not follow social distancing guidelines. And so we need to think about a new way to imagine this upcoming year. What we want to encourage you to do is to encourage your students to either bring something into the classroom or bring to their desk wherever they're doing their virtual learning that they can use when they need a mindful moment. So for young kids, that might be bringing like a squishy stress ball that they can squeeze when they're feeling really frustrated, or something that they can rub when they feel like they need to just be mindful and think about their senses for a moment. For older kids, it might look like having headphones that they can plug into their phone and listen to music for a second, or it might be printing out or writing down a poem or a quote or something like that that really grounds them. What's important here is that just kids have something to rely on when they can't do the things that they're used to being able to do in a classroom when they're feeling really frustrated. Next, I want to talk about movement. And this one, I think we've all probably felt over the last couple of months. I know for me, if I'm sitting on Zoom calls all day and I haven't gotten up to stretch or move around, not feeling great at the end of the day. And so I know this is probably the same for students, especially if they're sitting in front of a computer. It'll be important to incorporate movement into transitions. So even just stretching, doing a yoga pose, moving around in some type of way can be really helpful to help kids reset and get ready for their next activity. Next is focus on what you can control. So this area I'm going to talk about a little bit later, but I do want to mention that it's a little bit tricky. So kids are coming in with a lot of big, very legitimate issues, right? As Mike was saying, both individual factors and systemic factors are affecting how students are interacting and their mental health. And so we don't want to tell them to ignore all of the big things that they can't change, right? We want to affirm that those things are there, but also find small ways that we can change things. And one other thing that's related to this is just practicing gratitude, maybe writing one thing down every day that makes us feel good or that we appreciate. That can be helpful to alert us to the things that are positive and that we can control. But again, I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Next is affirmation. So kids, especially as they're getting older, it's really important to help them build their self-esteem, and especially during this time where a lot of things aren't feeling as positive as they might usually. So giving students opportunity to express the things that they're good at, to share ideas and to affirm those ideas, to celebrate small successes and small milestones as a class can be really helpful in making students both feel like they're part of a community, but also feeling good about themselves and really recognizing those strengths that we all have and how we can use them. And then last, just practicing healthy habits. And this isn't just eating well and sleeping and exercising, which honestly, as teachers, we can't necessarily control for our students. We can think about for ourselves, but we cannot fully control for students. But what I want to think about here is that actually using all of these other tools that we've just talked about, that is practicing a healthy habit, right? Practicing mindfulness, practicing ways to regulate yourselves and model that for students is an example of a healthy habit. And we know students really do well when they're seeing other people practice healthy habits. So the important thing here is that these skills are practiced and incorporated into day-to-day routines. Kids are not able to access coping skills when they're frustrated in the moment unless they've practiced those skills when they were calm. And so I think that's the big takeaway message for teachers is just when you're planning for the year, think about how you can incorporate these into transitions, into morning meeting, things like that, so that kids are getting exposure and practice as much as possible so that when they are feeling dysregulated, they have some skills that they can use. And kids can create a menu for themselves that include both these skills and other coping skills that they have. They can write it down, keep it in their desk, keep it at home, and reference it when they feel like they need to use one of these skills. Next, I want to get a little bit more broad and think about building an inclusive community. So we know that kids feel better when they feel like they belong. And we also know that not all kids do feel like they belong at school often. And so this is an opportunity to engage students in a way that increases inclusivity, but also helps kids feel safe. The other goal here is that we want kids to be responsible decision makers. We know now more than ever that some of our actions really have an impact on others around us, right? So the ways in which we go about the world right now very clearly impacts the spread of the virus, for example. And we want kids to be able to think about, how they are in control of certain things. So we wanted to share two guiding questions here that you can use with your class as you are building an inclusive community. One is, how are we going to make sure everyone feels included? And two is, how are we going to make sure everyone feels safe? Not just safe in terms of physical safety, but also emotional safety. So we encourage you to include students in decision-making processes. So what decorations are we going to put up in our classroom such that our classroom reflects our community? If we're not in the classroom, what Zoom backgrounds are we going to use? Or what song are we going to sing in our heads when we wash our hands to make sure that we're washing them for the appropriate amount of time? Students can be involved in decisions about routines. We know that routines are going to look very different, whether in the classroom or online. And so having kids really be bought into what the routine is can be helpful for teachers to make sure that that routine goes smoothly. And it's also an opportunity for teachers to model some flexibility if things need to change throughout the year. Next, how can kids participate in making community guidelines and deciding what rights and responsibilities students have in the classroom, both in the classroom or virtually? Similarly, student roles and responsibilities. How can we share responsibilities such that we are all part of the community and supporting ourselves and our classmates? And last, but probably most importantly, how can you have conversations with your students about discipline processes? And how can you brainstorm in advance what kinds of dilemmas are going to come up and how you as a community want to respond? I think that can be really helpful in allowing children to feel like the classroom is a fair place where they are safe and are going to be taken care of, again, both physically and emotionally. If they have some say in it, they're going to be much more bought in. So we want to make sure that all kids are incorporated in these conversations. And so that might mean that it's not just voting, for example, on how to make this routine work for everyone. It might be really like engaging in bigger and broader conversations, or finding other ways to include kids who either historically have not been included in the classroom or right now are not participating because they're feeling shy or whatever that looks like. Lastly, just want to go over empowering youth voices. So this is related, but I think we've seen more than ever this year that there are a lot of big problems, but we can control some of it, right? Organizing and raising our voices and speaking out against injustice has actually resulted in some real changes, both in our small community and in the broader world. So in the classroom, we encourage you to help your students learn about advocates, learn about advocacy, and find those small things that they can control. This is the focusing on what you can control. As teachers, you can give students opportunities to identify things they want to change and give them an opportunity to practice those things. Again, either related to your individual classroom or related to the broader community, right? Writing letters or speaking out against things that you think are unfair. That starts in the classroom. Hi, Leslie.
Hi, sorry.
No,
I was
it's
going to
okay.
say you can finish we can.
No, I'm good there.
Okay, so there was a question here about sort of this mindfulness process that you've been talking about and whether or not to give grades for that. And we thought you might want to expand on that or share more.
Yeah, so you're asking about whether or not to kind of give grades for kids being able to participate in that?
I think so. Yeah, it says the question is, should we not give grades for each of the mindfulness process?
Got it. So, I think it depends is probably the answer, but I would say probably not. I think what we really want is to give kids some kind of other reinforcement for practicing these skills. Not all kids are going to get it right away. And so while grades might not be the answer, I do think some kind of positive reinforcement would be helpful. We know that kids respond well and continue to do things when teachers either praise them or give them some kind of positive reward. And so, there's different ways to do that outside of grades. And I think that could be a good opportunity to think of other ways that you can reinforce that behavior. Again, because it's not necessarily fair for students to be getting graded on things that, are really difficult for them and important for their like personal mental health and coping. I will skip this just for the sake of time, but all of these things that we have just talked about are doable in the classroom or via online or blended learning. And so these are just things for you to think about as you're starting to plan for the year and as things might change throughout the year. We know that's a possibility as well. So just some considerations for you to look at when these are sent out. And I will pass to Maria now.
All right, thanks, Sydney. So you just heard from Sydney about some ways you can provide support classroom-wide, but you may have some students who need a little bit more. So just like we do in any other school year, we want to still make sure that we've tried Tier 1 classroom-wide supports before we move to Tier 2 or Tier 3. But if you see students displaying any of these listed symptoms, despite your classroom-wide efforts, that's when you want to make sure that you're paying closer attention and starting to collect some data. Some things to keep in mind about these things is both quiet and disruptive behaviors can be signs of depression, anxiety, and stress. And we can also think about these behaviors in terms of the fight, flight, or freeze responses that humans have to stress. So you might see students who are showing anger and rage, or hiding and running, or becoming tense, crying, shutting down. You may even see a combination of all three of those. You can also see that we've listed mostly behavioral symptoms here or signs because those can be harder to interpret, but you may have students too who express their feelings of sadness, anger, or fear to you verbally, especially if they're older. So as Sydney mentioned, it's helpful to validate those feelings. That's an extremely powerful way to strengthen your relationship and help the student to feel heard and supported. So as we discussed earlier, it's important to put a plan in place before we encounter any behaviors that we need to address, not just to prevent problem behaviors from arising, but so that we know how we are going to respond in the moment, step by step, so we can prevent ourselves from responding in ways that are maybe harsh or unhelpful when emotional intensity is already high. So children respond to how adults around them are behaving. Ideally, we want children to be able to co-regulate, which means that they model your response and regulation in the moment. To make that possible, it's important that you're able to stay calm yourself. So step back and take a breath first if you need to. But if you are calm, it'll help your students to feel calmer too. So some teachers write something down ahead of time to look at and remind themselves of helpful thoughts like, I'm going to remember that it's not personal, or I'm going to ask myself about what need this behavior might be communicating. And when you're ready to approach the student, you can start with describing what you're noticing. So for example, hey, I can tell you were really upset when whatever it was happened, or you seem distracted today. What's been on your mind? And you always want to validate their experiences as well. So like, wow, that does sound stressful, or it's hard to be calm when something like that's happening. From there, you want to encourage them to use some of those coping strategies that you've taught at the classroom level, some of those things Sydney had mentioned. And you also want to ask them what they need. So what did they think would help them to feel better? Or what do they need from you? Maybe would it help if they talk through it with you? And then have a conversation about problem solving if needed. So if you're kind of at odds, say like you need X, I need Y, how can we work together to make the situation better for everyone involved? And then after the situation has been resolved, you always want to go back and talk about it and make a plan for next time. So acknowledging that it was hard and asking things like, how can we prevent this from happening again? And next time it does happen, what will the student do differently? And what would they want you to do differently? Depending on the age of your students, you may need to provide more or less support as you're going through these steps. So it can be helpful with some students to provide concrete options. So to ask them like, were you angry or disappointed? Or would you rather take a break or get a new piece of paper as you're talking through the steps? So sometimes you will need to respond to behaviors with a consequence. So you've let the student know what you needed from them and what the consequence would be if they didn't change their behavior, and now you have to follow through. However, it's important for those consequences to be logical and restorative rather than punitive. So we know that punitive punishments might stop behavior in the moment, but they don't do anything to stop it from happening again in the future or to correct the problem that the behaviors caused. So as you may have heard if you attended the webinar last week on trauma responsive teaching, especially those behaviors, especially the challenging ones, are always communicating a need. So whether it's discomfort, anger, sadness, exhaustion, hunger, boredom, there's often a need for more attention or more support from you in some way. So seek to understand the need that's driving the behavior and then find other more appropriate ways that the student can communicate about it and have that need met. And when we say logical and restorative consequences, we're talking about having the student take responsibility for their misbehavior by acknowledging and working to undo any harm that it's caused. So this means things like cleaning up a mess they made or repairing anything broken, writing a sincere apology letter, or helping whoever it is that they might have hurt. And as Sydney mentioned earlier, it's helpful for students to have a say in how they think the situation should be handled. Okay, so before making a decision about whether a student needs additional support and what that support should look like, it's important to go through these concrete steps. So the first thing you want to do is gut check, just to make sure that your decisions around supports are based on objective, observable behaviors that you've been able to take note of and track, rather than assumptions of what the student might need based on their background or their characteristics. The next thing you want to do is gather more information. So ask the student about how they're doing and how you can support them. Engage their family in the discussion. See if they're seeing similar things at home. Contact former teachers to learn about what the students' behaviors looked like last year. Gathering information can be really helpful so that we don't over-pathologize children or attribute behaviors unnecessarily to our current context. And as you're doing this, seek to also observe and identify some of the students' strengths that'll be helpful to them. The next thing you want to do is consult. So bring in a school psychologist or a counselor or another teacher into that conversation and have them observe the student and share their perceptions and advice as well. It's always helpful to have multiple perspectives. And then finally, know your options. So before the start of the school year, create a list of the academic and mental health resources that are available to students. Take note of any new additions that might be changed as a result of COVID. And then identify what resources you'll use and who in the school you'll talk to for support for various personal and student needs. So that wraps up our webinar content for today. We're going to open up these last 10 minutes to questions from the audience. I'll go ahead and hand it off to Leslie, who I think is going to moderate for us.
Yeah. Thank you. So just as a reminder, there are multiple ways to ask questions here. If you'd like to speak with our presenters directly, maybe your question is a little longer, you want to add some info, you can raise your hand using the Zoom functionality. We will unmute you and you can engage directly with them. You can also type in your question into the Q&A feature again. So I have one that's waiting for all of our presenters. So I'll get us started on that and then allow others to either start working on typing in their questions or raise their hand to be able to speak directly with you. So when thinking about goals and including students in decision making, how can we include students in an only online situation? This will be different, I imagine, depending on the level. Therefore, specifically in elementary or middle school aged group.
I can start and then pass it off to anyone else who wants to jump in. So, I think that most of the areas that we mentioned, you can still talk about when you're online. So finding ways to seek feedback might look a little bit different. You might not be all raising your hand, right? You might need to send out a little Google survey to everyone to see what their preferences are, especially if they're not as comfortable on an online platform speaking up and sharing their preferences. But I think in terms of, thinking about routine, I think that's a really big one in an online space. It's going to look so different from the classroom. And so students can really get creative about how they want to shape their day and their online learning. And of course, you can't necessarily please everyone, but you can seek input from students about what that will look like. Roles and responsibilities, I think, normally elementary schoolers maybe have a line leader when they walk to lunch. Like, what can that look like in an online world? There certainly are a lot of areas that, someone may be able to lead morning meeting instead, or bring a fun song or a quote to start the day. And so there are just different ways to do it, but I think all of those areas are still important and relevant for online learning, even in elementary and middle school. If anyone else wants to jump in with some other responses, feel free.
I think that you did a really nice job of covering that. I would just add that, I think so much of it depends on the platform and the exact way in which you're going to think about delivering content. And so to me, one of the overarching things to think about is, in which ways can we give control back to students and allow them to make decisions, whether that's through a Google poll or through, if you're deciding to do a synchronous Zoom meeting, can we provide students choice, autonomy, and leadership in whatever the activities are that are planned for that day.
Thank you. Please, again, you're welcome to submit any questions you want to type out in the Q&A or raise your hand and we can unmute you to engage directly with the presenters. Looks like we have another question. To encourage getting to know you activities, it might be great to do some drive-bys. In elementary school, you might drive by. In high school, you might have each teacher take one class that they will drive by. It would be interesting to see if those students you went to did a better job in class. The relationship is everything.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great example of a creative solution to connecting with students. Honestly, as I'm planning my online class for the fall for undergraduate class, really learning from others who have much more experience in thinking about creative technology and using technology creatively to engage others. So I would rely on your peers to learn what works best for you in that circumstance, wherever you are.
Thanks. I've got a couple more questions. Can you say more about the quote, focus on what you can control, quote, strategy? How would we prompt students to engage in this type of thinking?
Yeah, I can start with that one. So really the Empowering Youth Voices slide that I went over was what we were trying to get at with focusing on what you can control. And so, again, kids are coming in having dealt with a lot of really big, seemingly uncontrollable experiences from the past few months. And for them, helping them and scaffolding the conversation about identifying what small thing they can change can be really helpful. And we don't want to do that at the expense of denying how big of a challenge that they are facing, but we do want to help them identify and then develop small action steps toward changing something that they can indeed control. And in this area, we really think about activism and kind of trying it out in the classroom. So for a teacher to say, you know, hey guys, like think about something that you're not liking about this online learning that we're doing and think about how you can take some small steps to change it. You know, write me a letter, right? Give them some kind of scaffolding again to practice that advocacy skill, because both you know, it will be helpful in their day-to-day lives, but again, will give them a sense of agency, autonomy, and leadership within the classroom, which can be really protective for mental health.
Great. I'm going to unmute Erin, who has a question and would like to speak directly with you.
So thank you for doing this. I love these 12 o'clock meetings. I could have them every day. They're great. I know that the first thing as a teacher, we need to keep our kids safe. And so, you know, when you say take away, you know, don't focus on what you can change, you know, is safety, like I was thinking, how am I going to, this is such a difficult situation. If everybody wore masks and if just nobody questioned it, done, we could all go to school. But, you know, that's really not what's happening. And so it's like, as a teacher, you know, do I give that up? That's the primary to keep kids safe. I would think a parent putting their child in school, they'd say, yeah, it's okay. Teachers are going to keep my kids safe. Well, how do you do that? You know, and how do you do that? Anybody?
Yeah, I think it's a tough question. I think in particular, it's tough when we're thinking about COVID, because we really don't know what the risk level is for different activities. We know some, and we know some activities that are more higher risk, in particular those that require close contact with students. So the extent to which we can get students to engage in some of the healthy behaviors like hand washing, like social distancing, you know, it is I think, you know, is prudent for us to do. And then I also think, you know, it's on you know, parents and students also need to make judgments for themselves about what risk tolerance they have in terms of, you know, is it how to balance going back to school and accessing all the supports that schools have versus staying home and accessing online learning that way. It's not an easy answer, and I do want to acknowledge that is you know, certainly a challenge that we're all facing. But helping students to appraise the risk and even sort of helping our colleagues appraise risk appropriately given the data that we have, I think is one of the ways to do that as well.
Well, I also think that the inequity of incomes, you know, I mean, if you're of a privilege, you can keep your kid home in private school or whatever, you know, you're going to embellish their education anywhere you go. But, you know, that other piece, you know, if you don't have the money, you might send them because you need a daycare or whatever, you know, and it's like, ouch.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And that is you know, it's an important consideration for us and for, you know, for administrators as we're planning going back, thinking about how do we balance both supporting students' access to quality education and mental health services with physical safety.
Thank you.
Thanks, Erin. We are going to have one more question. Do you have suggestions for supporting students' SEL in the virtual setting when students are English learners?
So I would point folks to the VDOE's resources that they've put out. The redesign recover packet has some resources there, and that is linked in our presentation as well if you don't have access to that. Again, this is a challenging issue, in particular because of language barriers that that would exist, and having access to quality translators, and having materials accessible both for students and for their families is really important there. But VDOE has provided some resources related to that as well.
Just another quick tip to jump in on there too is just making things as like visual as possible, modeling, demonstrating, kind of pairing that with the language to try and support understanding as well.
Great, thank you. We're going to take one more question for our presenters before wrapping up. So, balancing student stresses with the expectation that we are educators are providing them with measurable learning goals. I find myself struggling in determining the role of assessment and evaluation in my course. What recommendations do you have for crafting diverse assessments in a hybrid learning situation, keeping equity in mind?
That's not an easy question either, but it's also and hard to answer in the 1 minute or so we have remaining. I would say in terms of assessment, I think there are a lot of negatives discussed about assessment, but I do think there's an important piece that assessment provides us important data about how our students are learning and how they are coping with stress. So we should be thinking about assessment as informing that and using authentic assessments to assess how our instruction is happening and how students are coping, and then be responsive to that based on the data that we have gathered. Do something, make changes. So we shouldn't be scared of assessment or threatened by assessment when we think about assessment in that way. If we think about high stakes assessment, other things, there are critiques that are there as well. So that is one piece. Again, I think VDOE has provided some resources and some specific assessments that might be useful either for you as a classroom teacher or if you're an administrator, that can help us better understand how students are coping in this time. Sydney looks like she has something to add as well.
No, I'm good. Sorry.
Okay, well, great. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for joining us today and providing us with some more information about mental health, both for students and for teachers, and some concrete strategies to use. I see some thank yous on the chat, so thank you also on behalf of all the teachers. And thank you to everyone who joined us today to hear from the panelists. I just want to follow up with a little plug for next week's series. The topic is creating and sustaining equitable learning communities. So I know some of the questions that have been asked more recently in the last few minutes had to do with equity and assessment and thinking about ESL students and things like that. So those are topics that will be covered at least more in depth a little bit next week. So please join us next week, 12 o'clock, same time. You can go to our website to register if you have not done so yet. And as Leslie says, please email Youth-Nex if you need documentation for your professional development credits. And thank you everyone again for joining us this week. We hope to see you next week. Bye.